Okay, so let's talk about player experiences. Um, as Jesse Shell has said in his seminal 2008 book on game design, when people play games, they have an experience. It is this experience that the designer cares about. Without the experience, the game is worthless. Okay, so that's fine, and I think Jesse Shell is right on the money there. What game designers are creating are experiences. So we can visualize it like this. So we have our player, we have the game, our video games we're talking about here. And when the player plays the game, they have some sort of experience. But the question comes about, so what is an experience? So if we think about it here, the game presents experiences to the player. These experiences are made up of game elements presented in a specific configuration. The player carries out various activities in response to experiences presented by the game. And the player has a subjective internal response to what they perceive while carrying out those activities. So we can say experiences are made up of maybe three different parts. We can say that this is the number one, the game experience, or perhaps we could call it a game pattern, which describes the game elements and the way they are configured. There's also the player activity, which describes the actions the player takes while engaging with the game experience or the game pattern. And finally, then there's what we call the player experience. Now, this describes the player's subjective response to what they perceive while undertaking the player activity. So it's quite discrete there. When we talk about experience, really there are sort of three different levels to this concept of experience. So visually, we can see it here. Is also we've got we have our player on the left. We have our game experience or game pattern that's there on the right hand side. When the player interacts with the game, they undertake a player activity or particular actions that the player undertakes. And then in response to those actions, they have a subjective response, which occurs essentially internally, if you like. So it's maybe let's just call it an internal thing. So game experiences are designed by a game designer and built by the development team. Okay, that's fair enough. We kind of understand that. They're comprised of game elements in a specific configuration. And some examples could include, well, we've got like a door. It's pretty simple. A puzzle. So there's lots of different types of puzzles that we can think of. Perhaps an area designed for exploration and discovery. And also maybe a crafting system. So they might all be examples of experiences. Now, the player activities related to those experiences, let's think about those. So they're the actions of the player when undertaking the game experience. So these include opening and walking through a door. So I'm connecting these really with what we've just looked at. So the first one's a door. For the puzzle, well, the actions required to solve the puzzle are going to be the player activities. If we're creating an area designed for exploration and discovery, then the player's activities are going to be something like wandering around, exploring and interacting with the game world. And then if we have a crafting system, well, you're going to be having the player go through and collect resources and craft items. So they're the first two we talked about. So game experiences, also refer to these as game patterns, because that's what we're going to be calling them later. Player activities, and player experiences. Now, if you're familiar with MDA, we could potentially call these mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. Kind of fits in that way. Now, I haven't put under here explicitly the player experiences, basically because there's quite a lot more involved in describing the player experiences, but they are the subjective response when engaged in the activities that we've got here. Okay. Just one point of note here, just want to point out. So we have intended versus actual player experience. Now, of course, A game designer designs an intended player experience when you're designing a game. Generally, a designer will have in mind that they are trying to create a particular experience for the player. There are, of course, different factors at play in this formula. So, number one, we have the target audience. Now, consider let's use a couple of extremes. If you have a fast-paced action shooter game targeted at, say, a teenage audience, maybe targeted specifically at teenage boys, and you compare, and then you take that game and you give it to someone in their 80s, or someone who is very anti-violence and guns, then they may have a very different experience than the one that the game designer intends. So think about the target audience first up. And I know it's kind of difficult. It's not something that you've necessarily thought about before, but different sort of sectors, different sort of groups of people tend to have different interests, tend to have different responses. So that's the first factor. Second factor, of course, is the quality of the design and the quality of the development of the game. Now, it's interesting. I mean, this really, execution, what there is one saying, execution is everything. And I guess this is where it comes from. I mean, there are games out there that are very similar in many ways, and yet one works and one doesn't work. So the quality of the design and development really comes into it. And the final one, which we really have as game designers, developers, really have no power over, is the mental, emotional state of the player. Where are they at? Are they tired? Do they get no sleep the night before? Are they agitated? Have they had a fight with a good friend or something, or with a family member? You don't really know where they're at. So, and that does impact on the actual player experience. So the actual player experience may be different for individual players. It's going to be somewhat different. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But the final point we've got here, the actual player experience should match the intended player experience most of the time. When the player is part of the target audience. Now, this is what you work out really through testing when you're testing a game. Do your players mostly react as intended or not? If not, then you might want to change it. But I just wanted to point that out, intended versus actual player experiences, because of course we are talking about intended player experience. So let's consider an example. This is a very simple example. I wanted to start with a simple example, partly to display some interesting aspects here. So opening the door of a base. This is something that happens in a lot of different games. Let's consider this in two survival games, Subnautica and Rust. So they're both survival games. They both involve creating bases and going in and out of the base. So let's particularly focus on exiting the base, because that's quite an interesting one, particularly in Rust. So Subnautica. Okay, let's actually, before we start, let me pause here, and then we'll come back and actually look at an example. So we'll just pause for a sec.